G'day, g'day. Could I just get a quick thumbs up? You can hear me okay and the audio is coming through fine? Fantastic. All right. So, on the topic, wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. Quickly, I'm just going to outline what I reckon I'd like to see from this particular motion, and then I'm going to get into a moral argument about why there is a obligation for these nations to provide that. And then I'm just going to provide a little bit of a historical context, which I think also sort of adds weight to the case. So what I would like to see is wealthy nations band together in much in the same way that they currently distribute foreign aid, that they distribute this in development projects to developing countries all around the world. I'd like this headed up by, perhaps non-government organizations that are headed up by economists that can figure out what the most efficient use of that resources are, and also try to sidestep a lot of the issues that we have in terms of like corrupt, leaders within these developing countries and stuff. So onto the moral argument. The simple moral argument I'm going to make in this particular case is that because wealthy nations have the capacity to help people in the world, that therefore transfers an obligation. Similarly, if I am a person who is just walking along and I see a child drowning in a nearby pool, the fact that I am the most immediate person to that child, that I have the most capacity to help that, infers upon me a moral obligation to help that. In the same sort of way, if we consider all of the people in the world who have vast amounts of wealth, they have the capacity through that excess wealth to be able to alleviate the huge amounts of suffering that currently go on in developing nations. And by means of doing that, they therefore that transfers them a moral obligation to do so. Specifically why I think that this is the best way to be able to do that is because it ultimately is just the most efficient, that these people, that obligation belongs to everyone, all the citizens of the wealthy nations in the world, that those citizens can infer that responsibility onto their governments by the merit of tax, and then that tax can then be going into development. And development is the best way to help these people because unlike something like aid, it's something that can be useful going forward because you kind of set a ball rolling of economic development that helps lift these people out of poverty in a long-term sustainable solution. So that is the crux of the moral argument I'm presenting in this case. The second thing that I just want to notice is historical context is that if you look at the reasons why wealthy nations are wealthy in the way, that often this comes in at a cost to the underdeveloped nations that exist around the world. So for example, a lot of the post-colonial powers that exist in Europe got vast amounts of their wealth from plundering the natural resources of much of what is currently the developing world. If we look to America, we can see the way that the transatlantic slave trade operated as huge amounts of wealth transfer that came in terms of disruptive to the economies from Africa to other places. But even in cases where wealth hasn't been directly taken from these nations, that places, even developed nations like China and America, again, have engaged in multiple military interventions in numerous countries around the world that has destabilized the geopolitical area within there. And destabilized geopolitical areas are much harder to create developing economies. So they take some kind of responsibility for the circumstances, and thus they have an additional obligation to help. And I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I think the first thing that I should go ahead and tie together here is the resolution is that wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. So development assistance, that actually is not military aid. But the thing is actually defined by the United States military defines it in a way that by giving someone aid that they are accepting our values. So there's strings attached to the aid, and that creates a lot of problems with corruption. So I mean, I think that the resolution is what I'm trying to get at here is the resolution is I think is a little more general than what you're saying. So as far as the military aid goes, we should just cut all the aid. I'm saying not to have any aid, so I'm saying no intervention whatsoever, pretty much, in this debate. So I don't think that the military, I mean, yeah, it's not so much that we have an obligation because we attack the country or whatever. It's that we would have an obligation in general. Be like if you look at, because of course if you look at the aid that we give in the Middle East, we're giving Egypt and Jordan a lot of aid to be our buddy over there. So we're buying the vote at the UN, we're buying the country. So it all kind of ties together. So I think if you're against the military aid, you would be against the idea of any kind of aid, pretty much. And it's not too much. It's not really so much to hold as so much of a cold shoulder. I'll have about a minute here, but of course the old adage, and this is pretty much the spiel that you're going to hear me say throughout the debate is that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. But if you teach him to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And the thing is, I know you're going to talk about some history, but the history of foreign aid, can you prove in that history that the foreign aid has increased growth? Because it hasn't. And it actually puts us, like I'm in a wealthy country, the United States, it puts me in a position where there's less resources, because the ultimately the resources aren't only what's in the ground there, it's also the people. So the people are a resource, and their labor is competitive in the market. So I mean, we don't need to tell somebody to have capitalism at the end of a stick. They can adopt it anyway. They can adopt these free market values anyway without us doing anything. So those are my main contentions and the primary arguments. And I'll have a few seconds, so I'm going to have to pass it back.
So I'm going to respond to the three claims that you made there. First thing you want to say is that currently the way that aid is given is there's strings attached, and there's problems to that. Two responses to this. Firstly, that is a practical argument that doesn't address the two principled concerns I have made to you, is that even if this aid is given imperfectly, that we still have an obligation to be able to provide this aid. Secondly, I would say that I do not have to support the giving of aid with those strings attached. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit later about why the way foreign aid has been given previously in the past is bad. The thing that I support is a unilateral, like altruistic movement from all the wealthy nations, like collectively pooling resources together, discussing with economists to figure out what is the most efficient way that they can give this money out in order to be able to stimulate economic development, and then doing so purely for the benefit of trying to raise those people out of poverty. I think that I'm fine to be able to support that, and that we can get away from having these strings attached. The second thing that you want to address is that we don't necessarily have an obligation to these countries just because we particularly attack them. Just to reiterate my substantive point and expand upon that a little more. If you are a country that has in some way necessitated that another country is in poverty, insofar as that we know that it's very hard to create economically stable conditions when you have rotating dictatorships, when there are wars that are going on because you can't have a stable financial market when your country is in constant conflict with another. That is a direct consequence of the actions of people who are the actions of countries that have staged those military interventions. So insofar as they have prevented that economic growth from occurring naturally, that then infers upon them an obligation to go in posthumously and re-stimulate that economic growth, because it is because of their actions that they have inhibited that economic growth in the first place. So I think that is a strong moral case about why that obligation exists. Secondly, to respond to the kind of main substantive crux that you want to say about teaching people to fish. As I already kind of iterated in my introduction to this particular case, the thing that I support, I think it looks much more like trying to stimulate economic growth as teaching the men to fish rather than just sort of giving out the fishes in the first place. I think that conventional foreign aid, and you wanted to point to this idea that conventional foreign aid hasn't pulled people out of poverty yet. I think that that's largely to do with the fact that a lot of the way that foreign aid has been given up until this point has been used as a political tool to try to garner favor garner negotiations between various countries that has not actually been done with the goal of altruistically trying to lift people out of poverty. I would say that my new model, that is where money is spent specifically in a way with the specific intention to try to lift people out of poverty, is a new paradigm and something that you'll be able to move away from that. And I think that once you are able to stimulate that economic growth and kind of, get those businesses going, get those markets going, obviously they become self-sufficient, because now the people who are working in those markets have capital to be able to reinvest in those markets. People have money to be able to spend. And once you get that ball rolling, you are able to kind of step away from it. So this aid does not need to last forever.
The thing about, I mean, I'm really interested in learning where you're trying to go with this new model, and because I think that's going to be a challenge to illustrate, because there's just no evidence, as I've asked you, there's just no evidence that foreign aid has done anything to spur growth, and that we're not doing anything but feeding the corruption of these countries. And this isn't the Monroe Doctrine. This isn't the United States saying we have to help rebuild Europe. Our interest should be in trade, and the best way to improve would be through free trade with these countries. But I think the big thing that you're missing here, and this is something I talk about a lot on the site, is that it's just that is the effects of overpopulation. So when you say that everyone needs to band together and to end poverty, because we have, the thing is that you're not answering the question of overpopulation. So we're not solving that by just giving people a handout, because we're not changing the status quo. And that it's, so not only is there less growth, there's more people, and that means less resources for the United States. And it's not really so much that our Australia, even though the United States gives the most of the aid, which is 10 times more than Australia and is the UN and all that. But the thing is, so the resources aren't going here. Okay, because I'm not getting something back, and I'm not teaching these people how to live a better life. Is the problem here? So I think morally we have an obligation to teach people to fish, and I mean it's a nice idea to think that we could do things, but it's not the Monroe Doctrine. It's not something that's happening now. And the thing that's happening now is overpopulation, especially like in an area like Sudan. And then let's look at the Middle East, okay? Because we have a country in the Middle East that is a desert, right? And because Israel, they're doing a really good job with this, like where they don't have any resources, and they built it. The reason we're talking today is because of the technology that they made, right? Like they have all these technology innovations, agricultural innovations, hydroponics. It's all Israeli. They developed all this technology because they're in the desert. They're trying to answer the question of overpopulation, but the system that you're talking about doesn't do that. So I think there's a real problem here that you're ignoring. And let's go ahead and, I mean, in the 10 seconds, think about China and how developing agriculture got them off foreign aid, where they're actually giving foreign aid to Africa now, and they're competing with us.
Absolutely. And I would include China in my list of like wealthy nations that specifically donate. And so, yeah, just to address some of the concerns there. So once again, the thing that I'm looking to do here is that I think both of us would like to see some kind of economic development from these. Like both of us eventually would like to get to the point where this aid is no longer necessary, right? We want to stimulate these economies to the point where they are self-sufficient, where they are producing adequate capital to ensure a standard of quality of life for everyone within their country. And at that point, I'm happy to say that we can withdraw the aid because we've kind of done our job. To get there to that point, I think that there are some kind of investments that need to be made. Once again, your contention is saying, well, foreign aid doesn't work. I already pointed out it's because it's not being given efficiently. It's being given as a political tool that often just goes to corrupt governments. I outlined in my model how I think that if you donate that specifically in ways in which economists recommend, that you would be able to get much better results. To give you an example of some of those results, so there's a charity called Effective Altruism that basically looks to try to do a lot of good with people's money. And the thing that they found that was really useful was just direct investment in rural African communities, where they basically just gave communities a bunch of money and said, here, go start your own business, do these sort of things. And they found that that was hugely effective in the areas that they concentrated. Even quite small amounts of wealth managed to become much more thriving micro economies because people were able to invest that wealth in that business and be able to grow those economies themselves. So those are the types of things that I support. And I think that you know, like buying a bunch of technology to be able to farm rice really efficiently and then giving it a bunch of people in rural Asia, buying technologies that enable better agriculture and better irrigation and then giving them to places like drought resistant Africa. I think that these are like simple ideas that are not being done currently because there's no political advantage to be able to do so, but can be done if we're taking the genuine role of trying to lift people out of poverty. Your counterfactual that you provided is that we would rather trade with these people, right? The thing that I would like to point out here is that if we can stimulate these economies to the point where they are bountiful and are providing enough for the people, they are much better trade partners because they are still able to exploit whatever comparative advantage they have on the market. Say if they exist in the coffee bean belt, they're still able to grow a bunch of coffee beans and send that out to the rest of the world. But instead of being a single resource economy, which are very unstable because they're subject to massive fluctuations in the market and things like that, you have a diversified economy which is able to better weather the tides of global economic trends. So I think that we would rather get to the state where we are able to stimulate those economies because they then provide better trade partners for us in the long run. Lastly, just to touch on population. Overpopulation is a problem. You benefit this more under my side of the house because you are able to turn members of population into resource providers for the rest of the community. So currently overpopulation in place like India is a huge problem because you have a bunch of people also who are out of a job. If you're able to take those people and turn them into farmers, they could then produce more food for the rest of the population, which helps solve the problem.
Okay. So when you say that the problem that of giving is a tool, I mean, we both agree that we shouldn't be giving people money for leverage. We shouldn't be giving them a vote at the UN. The thing with that is that the United States, our policy, we're giving most of this money. I'll go ahead and read it to you. Our policy is that you kind of have is basically that if we give you the money, we'll do. You have to do what we say. So I think that the United States, the definition of development assistance is well, it's I can't find it on my notes, but we're saying that by giving the United States military is saying that by giving this money away that it has to be in our strategic interest. I can't find the exact definition and policy of that, but so I think that's going to be a hard hurdle to get over because we are the UN, we're the United States, and we're saying that if we give you this money, you have to. It's on our terms. So yeah, it's a problem, but I don't see how you get around that. And when you say it's opportunity, I mean, why isn't someone investing in that now? There's plenty of people with money to invest, right? I mean, there's a whole news, the Wall Street Journal, right, about investing. And I mean, maybe it helps some people in Africa, but would that system would it help in Afghanistan? I mean, people could do that anyway. The government doesn't have to do that. There's plenty of people who would invest. You say there's the economists behind it. Why haven't they convinced anyone to invest into it? And when you say that it will answer overpopulation because they'll become resource providers, it's kind of funny that you mentioned India because the studies on foreign aid and overpopulation point directly to the labor competition between the United States and India. And the thing is, the United States, we're 6 times, the quality of our labor is 6 times what the quality of someone in India's labor is. So you're not really measuring the quality of the labor. And going back to what I said before, the Israelis have this figured out. They have a whole economy around it. I think these other they don't have to be the only economy doing this. They could, someone else could develop technology and agricultural products and that sort of thing. Even if they don't have resources, and of course they can trade their resources and instead of us giving them money not to.
Okay, cool. To respond to a couple of those points. So you keep coming back to this US policy and this idea that this money would be inherently attached with, strings or other conditions. The thing that I am supporting is this money being donated altruistically to projects around the world that help developing nations develop their economies and lift people out of poverty. That means that, I think it's unfair of you to just say, oh, well, the way that we're going to give this money is always going to be with strings attached, because I think that specifically within the context of this debate, we're arguing about whether or not there is an obligation to do that in the first place. To say, well, that obligation doesn't exist because when we fulfill it, we're going to do it badly, doesn't actually disprove that obligation, because I can just say, well, let's not fulfill it badly. Let's fulfill it in a good way, right? So I think that is something that needs to be responded to. Your ideas about investment and the quality of labor in India. The thing that you missed when you were saying that's well, why hasn't someone invested in this already? The difference is because when I was talking about the effect of altruism, that's not like an investment in a company where they get money back. They just give huge amounts of money to these people to be able to develop their businesses, right? The thing that needs to be able to lift these people out of poverty is not something in which there is a profit return on an investment, is that there just needs to be a lot of sunk costs that go into these things, right? That is why the private market is not an adequate solution for this thing, because that is, they are unable to act unless there is a way for them to get profits back. That is why it has to be done by governments and by extension the citizens of the world, because they collectively have the capacity to donate amounts of their wealth while having relatively little impact upon themselves, and then through taxation and then through their government giving it to these projects, that is a way that they are able to fulfill that particular burden. You addressed something about the quality of labor in India. I would point out that that's probably another really good example of ways in which we could spend that money that isn't going to get a return on investment, but could issue huge development in the way of education, right? Like that is something like paying to educate a huge number of the population is something that can increase their quality of labor, increase their supply on the job market, can make them skilled laborers as opposed to unskilled laborers, which means that when you then give them that farming equipment, they are able to do that self-sufficiently as opposed to have to be supervised by another person. But it is something in which there is no inherent return on investment. So we can't rely on the private market to solve that problem for us. But education into these skills around the world would be another great way to be able to spend this money in a way that we can see tangible results coming back. Lastly, you addressed a couple of times points about Israel and how they've got it figured out. I didn't really understand this point. I think it's something to do with innovation. I would say that innovation just happens better when there are more developed economies. I think that as underdeveloped economies currently sit, there's not room enough for innovation because they're trying to worry about just trying to scrape by from week to week. When you don't have to worry about living hand to mouth or farm to plate, and instead you can actually have a bit of room to breathe. That is the space where innovation flourishes. So I think we get more innovation under my side of the house. But
I don't think there's going to be a lot of innovation because you're not spurring growth. There's no evidence, as I keep saying, there's no evidence that you're not spurring growth, which is why I'm saying we don't have a burden or an obligation to provide this aid, because it doesn't. There's no evidence that it doesn't spur wealth. And the problem, I'm saying that we don't have the obligation because we're facing overpopulation. I'm saying that we don't have this obligation because all the foreign aid is tied together. I'm saying that it might be nice to assume that we can have an equality of outcome and think that a country would get together and do this. But the thing is, it's the United States policy, it's our open policy, that if we give you the money, it's with strings. And I don't think that that's going to change. The United States is in a terror war. So that, I mean, that, and giving foreign aid to a country like Afghanistan, that's not helping. Even I'm talking about development aid. I'm not hearing those points answered. And you're saying just give. I mean, sure, if you have a company, if a private investor, that's not a nation. If they just want to give them money, sure, do it. But my question to you isn't that. I'm just saying, well, why doesn't somebody just go ahead and invest in it then, right? I mean, sure, they can both generate wealth. It'll be free trade. It'll be a beneficial relationship. And then you say it won't have strings attached, and then you talk about education. I mean, if we're paying for it, I mean, what are we going to teach these people? I mean, what do you think we're going to teach them if we're paying? I mean, you don't think there's going to be strings attached to what we teach in the school? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sound. I talk about this Israel thing on here a lot. That's not what this debate is about. I'm using them as an example here because they have built a country over the past 70 years in a desert that's overpopulated. So it's a situation where there's overpopulation, and there's no resources there. They don't even have enough water for everyone. They have to import 40% of their food. But the thing is that they have developed agriculture like no one ever could, and they've developed all the like hydroponic growing, like all the scientific gardening, technology gardening. They developed all that. All the technology that our smartphones, the technology that we're talking to each other. They develop technology, so they put money into agriculture and technology, so they have products that they can sell, and everyone has to buy them. I mean, that's the big BDS's biggest problem, is that the processors in these machines are Israeli. So how are you going to? So that's the comparison there, is that somebody has this figured out. They know how to solve this.
Yeah, just to think of it, isn't Israel like the biggest, recipient of foreign aid in the world? So I think that if you're claiming that that's a, country that's doing pretty well, that's probably a point from my side. Look, I'm just going to deal with the two main claims about evidence, and then I'm going to have some closing statements about the moral claims. So you keep bringing up this idea that I haven't provided enough evidence that this was something that was going to work. As I already addressed, okay, so just firstly, That's not a claim that disputes the moral claim that I have made, insofar as that we have an obligation to help these people. If it's the case that it is difficult to do so, that does not diffuse the ability for us to be able to do so. But specifically on evidence about why I think this is effective, I gave you multiple reasons and multiple pieces of economic analysis and things that have been proven to spur economic development, such as education, such as development in infrastructure, such as new additions in farming technology. And I also pointed out two microcosms that have been headed up by places like by institutions such as Effective Altruism that have managed to achieve through direct donation on a small scale stimulation of economies. So given that I have provided you multiple just economic pieces of analysis and small examples about where this is at work, for you to turn around and say, well, there hasn't been a country that's been lifted out of poverty because of that, I think is inadequate to be able to address those points. And I could probably just point to Israel and say, without all the foreign aid we give them, they would probably collapse. So that's fine. But lastly, in my closing statements, I'd just like to reiterate the moral the claims that I've made that I don't think have really been addressed within this debate, which is that one, developing and wealthy nations have the capacity as a whole to be able to alleviate suffering within the rest of the world by donating this money to those people, and that infers them upon an obligation to be able to do so. Additionally, the actions that have been taken by the governments of those wealthy nations had often played a role in hampering the natural economic development of those nations in the past, and thus some responsibility for fixing those problems and bringing those people out of poverty and bringing them out of suffering rests upon us. Additionally, that is a moral obligation that sits with us. And even if it's true that all of your arguments about why this is going to be effective, why it was there are problems in because there are strings attached, why all of this is something that ultimately is going to come with all these kind of conditions, that is inadequately address the moral argument that I have provided to you about why that obligation exists. In order to win this debate, you needed to have engaged with why that moral obligation does not exist, not just what you would rather see and which way in which that would be more effective. Because maybe you'd say, yes, it would produce us more profit if we were to just trade with them, but that does not respond to the fact that we have a moral obligation to help people in suffering because we have the capacity to do so, and we are in some small part responsible for that suffering. Those are the arguments that I've presented to you, and I've also presented you a long laundry list of economic analysis about why direct monetary intervention will stimulate these economies, and so thus it is an effective discharge of our moral obligation. And in your closing statements, I'd like you to respond to those arguments.
Of course, you don't feel like your contentions are being answered because you have the resolution wrong. Like I said in my first rebuttal, I'm saying that the reason that you're saying that because of things that happened in the past that we have a responsibility now, and I'm saying that the resolution just says that we have a responsibility in general. So that's just a disagreement on definitions. And I mean, your whole case, I've totally. The thing is that you've given me this, you have this expectancy of an opportunity of outcome, and I've said that the equality of opportunity isn't there, and that we need to provide the equality of opportunity. And going back to Israel, of course they collapse if we stop giving them aid because it's all military aid. The development aid doesn't go to Israel; it goes to the Palestinians, and we threaten to cut it off from the Palestinians when they get a state of the UN. We use it as leverage. We also give it to Egypt and Jordan to be our buddy. So yeah, of course it would collapse, but the money that we're talking about isn't money that's going to Israel. That's all military aid. It's not the same thing. Yeah, we give them too much money, but it's for military stuff. The actual development aid goes to other countries to be like Jordan and Egypt. So yeah, they collapse, but they go together. So which is my other contention, that the reason that we don't have the obligation is because it's military. But the thing that I've said that isn't because it's all tied to the military. It's all tied, like we're fighting a war on terrorism. And the United States, as I said over and over again, like we're saying, if we give you this money, you have to do what we say is at the end of our stick. So I've totally won on that. You've never answered that. You're saying, well, that the economists are saying that that it would work. We just have to do it this way. Just give them the money. But you said you didn't say it was the government that did that. You said it was private investors. And I asked you why private investors just don't do that anyway, because why not? And you never answered that. And it's not about profit. Like I said, I want to teach someone to fish. Like I would rather that they were able to trade and do it on their own, especially because, as I keep saying, because of overpopulation, that we can't give. We're not spurring growth because of overpopulation, and we're only feeding into the overpopulation. We're not giving it incentives that would create the opportunity. So there can't be inequality of opportunity. Yeah, I mean, I think that things in the 30 seconds I have left. I mean, that's the difference. The difference here is that I've seen inequality of outcome. I've seen what that looks like, but I don't see where the opportunity is, because you're pointing to private investors. You're not pointing to governments. You didn't give me. You said you gave an example, but you didn't give an example of anything that a government did. You said that a private investor did, and you didn't explain why they wouldn't do it anyway. So there's no evidence that this foreign aid has helped anyone. We need to teach people how to fish.